Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Goal Attainment Scaling in Clinical Research and Practice, Insights from Experts. My name is Aisha Rashid and I will be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this time, I'd like to thank Ardea Outcomes for putting together the content for this presentation. Ardea Outcomes is a purpose-driven contract research organization committed to enhancing health outcomes through patient-centric research. The company's services focus on implementing goal attainment scaling, or GAS, within clinical development, an area of research honed by the company's founders for over 30 years. Ardea offers a comprehensive suite of products and services dedicated to GAS research, including study design, goal inventory development, comprehensive GAS training for clinicians, goal quality assurance, and GAS clinical data monitoring enabled by the company's proprietary patent-pending GAS-focused electronic data capture platform, GoalNav. At Ardea Outcomes, the focus is shifted from what's the matter to what matters most for patients and caregivers in clinical research and care settings. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speakers for today's event. Professor Lynne Turner-Stokes is the Northwick Park Professor of Rehabilitation Medicine at King's College London. She's been a driving force in rehabilitation medicine since 2001. She has championed the implementation of GAS in routine clinical practice for the last 20 years. And introducing tools such as the GAS Lite and GASias to make GAS easier for clinicians to use. Professor Turner-Stokes serves as Chief Investigator for the Upper Limb International Spasticity or ULIS program, conducting impactful international studies. With over 200 publications, her research focuses on health services research, utilizing methodologies like systematic reviews and large data set analyses. Chere Chapman started her career as a patient-centered outcomes researcher at Dalhousie University, where she published her first quality of life paper with her biology honors supervisor, Dr. Rockwood. After a year in Japan, Chere returned to Canada to get her master's in health science and community health and epidemiology from the University of Toronto. There, she developed a passion for HIV research, which led her to Singapore as a staff epidemiologist at the Communicable Disease Centre. From there, she went to the UK to do her MBA at the London Business School, immersing herself in social entrepreneurship and purpose-led business. Chere returned to Asia to establish a consultancy in Singapore and Vietnam, developing multi-stakeholder partnerships with international NGOs and Fortune 100 companies. Chere's East Coast Canadian roots eventually pulled her back to Halifax to co-found Ardea Outcomes with her mentor, Dr. Rockwood. Chere is a sought-after board member, investor, and mentor in the startup ecosystem in Atlantic Canada. Dr. Sevinc has a multidisciplinary background with training and research experience in basic and clinical sciences. After obtaining her BSc degree in psychology and her MSc degree in mental health sciences, she pursued a career in clinical research as a psychologist, conducting in-person and remote assessments. She then earned her PhD degree in neuroscience from Istanbul University. During her PhD, she had a visiting fellowship at Cornell University, where she completed her dissertation on neural networks associated with social cognition. She continued her career with a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School Department of Psychiatry. During her fellowship, she utilized clinical trial methodology to examine mindfulness training dependent cognition and neural function changes. Dr. Sevinc joined Ardea Outcomes as a research manager, leading research operations and internal research projects in personalized endpoints, particularly in goal attainment scaling. And now, without further ado, I'm going to pass over the mic to our speakers, beginning with Professor Turner-Stokes. You may begin when ready.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that people can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Good. So I'm just going to carry on. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this useful webinar, and I hope that there'll be a lot of interesting discussion. So outcome measurement, as we know, is essential for clinical practice. There are challenges for the wide diversity in conditions, in level of ability, and in goals for treatment. And this means there's no one size fits all. Validated standardized measures such as the FIM form a useful yardstick, but they don't necessarily capture all of the individual intentions for treatment. Goal Attainment Scaling, or GAS, provides a person-centered, individualized approach to measuring achievement of intention. Did we achieve what we set out to achieve? Some goals will be achieved, others won't. Some may exceed expectation. Some goals are more important than others, some are more difficult than others. GAS captures all of this in a single overall measure. If we think about the different types of measure, first of all, we have interval measures where the numbers are actually real numbers, i.e. a score of 4 is twice a score of 2. Then we have, most commonly in healthcare, ordinal measures, which is like measuring with a piece of string. We know that something is longer or shorter or bigger or smaller than something else, but we don't know by how much. GAS is different. It's an entirely different concept. It's like measuring with a bunch of elastic bands, because those multiple elastic bands are stretched or contracted to suit the individual's goals. So it's not a measure of outcome per se. It doesn't stand alone. We need standardized measures alongside it to provide a yardstick for comparison. Goal setting is the critical first step. So we have to discuss and agree the priorities and objectives for the program with the patient and the family and the multidisciplinary team, and then consider the expected outcomes from treatment. If those expectations are unrealistic, which they can be, then we can negotiate what can reasonably be achieved and ask ourselves, is the expected outcome still worthwhile? Then we describe and document the expected outcome, and we ensure that that's understood and agreed by everybody, including the patient and the team. And we do this by defining SMART goals. Those goals must be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. So just to give a brief overview of GAS, it started in the 1960s when Chere and Sherman developed it in the context of mental health. They designed the goal achievement scale based on a 5-point scale ranging from -2 to +2, where the 0 score is achieved when the goal is achieved as expected. So if you achieve it a bit more than that, you get +1, a lot more, +2, a little less, -1, a lot less, -2. They recommended an a priori follow-up guide, and here's an example over to the right here, which sets out specific descriptors for each of those score levels. Goals can be weighted for importance or difficulty, and then at the end, the various goal scores are assimilated into a T-score. Now, the T-score is a formula that is designed to essentially create a data set such that if you set goals in an unbiased fashion, so you overachieve and underachieve them equally, you'll have a mean GAS score of 50 with a standard deviation of ±10 in a nice normal distribution to which you can then apply parametric statistics. How do I know it's 50 and 10? Because there's a 50 here and a 10 there in the formula. And that's about all we need to know about the formula, and I'm not going to say any more about it. So when it comes to using gas in clinical practice, there are a few challenges. Lots of clinicians set goals for treatment, but not very many record the achievement or even reflect on it. One of the problems with the traditional gas, as described by Chere Chapman, was that it's quite time consuming setting all those descriptors for the different 5 levels. And also clinicians are quite wary of numbers. You do all that work and you achieve the goal and you still only score 0. And even worse, if you nearly get there but not quite, you get -1. And people don't necessarily like that, and they're even more wary of formulae. So numbers and clinicians don't often go together. So how can we make gas practical for use in routine clinical work? We need to have it something that is simple and timely to use. It involves patients and their family in that goal setting, fits in with clinical thinking, and helps to inform clinical decision making, and avoids numbers if at all possible. So if we break down the 6 key steps to goal setting, we have our patient, we identify the problems, we ask if they're amenable to treatment and with what intervention. Then we identify the broad goal areas and consider whether those are worthwhile. If they are, we define the SMART goals as we've discussed. We set maybe 3 to 5 goals, we do our intervention, and then we evaluate our goal achievement on that 5-point scale. And if we do all that, then gas just simply falls out of that. And that's part of clinical practice that most of us recognize as part of our daily routine. So the gas light is basically a simplified approach to gas. It was designed to be practical for use in busy clinical settings and aligned with the way that clinicians think, in such a way that that measurement just simply falls out of the clinical decision making. And that's what we set out to do with our initial practical guide, which was published in 2009. So just in a step-by-step approach, we use the same gas 5-point scale where 0 score is the most probable level achieved if the patient receives the expected treatment. But there's no need in gas light to define each level. We simply focus on defining the SMART goal for that 0 score. And then when we get to it, we ask ourselves with whether the patient achieved more or less, and we rate it from there. So goal weighting. Some goals, as we've said, matter more to a patient than others. So some present more of a challenge than others. So to take those into account, we can weight the goals for importance to the patient and family and the difficulty of achieving that goal, which is rated by the team. So we can do that on a 4-point scale, same 4-point scale for each of them. In point of fact, it's a 3-point scale, because if a goal is not at all important and not at all difficult, it's not really going to be set as a goal. So essentially, these are 3-point scales, and they're relatively quick and easy to apply. At the baseline, we identify the patient's function with respect to that particular goal. We usually rate at -1 to allow for deterioration unless no clinically plausible worst condition exists. So we ask ourselves at baseline, does the patient have some function in relation to that goal, in which case they score -1, or are they completely unable or as bad as they could be, or have a pain score of 10 out of 10, no clinically plausible worst condition, they start at -2. When it comes to rating goal attainment, many clinicians prefer to think in words and not numbers. So we ask ourselves, was the goal achieved? Yes. Was it achieved as expected? A little better than expected? A lot better than expected. Was the goal not achieved? Then was it partially achieved, or was it essentially they're no different from when they started, or are they in fact worse? So what we have here is a 6-point verbal scale. And it's for that reason that some authors have suggested that we have a -3 score to denote a worse condition. The problem with that is we then have something that goes from -3 to +2, so we've immediately skewed the normal data distribution. And anyway, there's no need to do that. Because what we can do is we can apply the numerical scoring retrospectively. So how do we convert that numerical score? We allocate the outcome score according to the baseline score. So here's our verbal scale. Was it achieved? Yes, no. And how much. So that's our 6-point verbal scale. And depending on whether the baseline was -1 or -2, then the numbers are added in. I'll come back to how that actually happens in practice later, but that's how it works. Goal weighting is optional. It takes time, and actually it makes very little difference to the scores. And it can have a perverse effect. So importance works as you would expect it would. A more important goal will score more highly on the GAS T-score if it's achieved. But difficulty doesn't work that way. If there's a difficult goal and it's not achieved, then it actually penalizes the GAS T-score more than an easy goal, which is counterintuitive. So weighting can be really useful for team reflection. If a goal wasn't achieved, was it known to be difficult? How important was it to the patient? It can be useful for that discussion, which we all should be having as part of our goal attainment scaling review. But if we use the weighting in the formula, then I would recommend using the importance weight only, because then we've got something that is reflecting what mattered to the patient. And then whether or not we achieved it comes back down to our reflection process. But in reality, you don't really need to include the weights in the calculation, because it makes very, very little difference to the overall scores. So just to summarize the Gaslight, key differences between Gaslight and the standard gas are, first of all, that we set that baseline score -1 if there is a clinically plausible worst condition, -2 if there's no plausible worst condition. No need to define each of the 5 levels with our follow-up guide. We simply concentrate on defining that 0 score level with a smart goal description, which we agree carefully between the team and the family. And then at the evaluation point, we jointly agree together with the patient and with their family, if they're involved, and the team, the verbal rating score on the 6-point scale, which reflects how the clinician think. And then we put that into the GAS calculator software, which deals with all the numbers and applies the formulae and converts it to a numerical score. That's all programmed into the software, and it keeps clinicians well away from numbers. And what we found is, because of that, we've found that the Gaslight is now quite widely taken up in clinical practice. So how does it compare with the traditional GAS method? We recently done a study with a head-to-head comparison in an Australian sample, where we compared the standard gas with the Gaslight in the same group of patients where they acted as their own controls. There were 60 patients, 136 goals. And in terms of individual absolute agreement, we had intraclass correlation coefficients of 0.88. And in terms of sensitivity to change over time, using the standardized response mean, they were very similar results. Importantly, we also asked 19 clinicians and 52 participants what they felt about the Gaslight. And what they came out with was that the clinicians said that it was quicker and easier to use and easier to understand. And the patients said that it was acceptable, comfortable, worthwhile, and helpful. So we have some evidence that it produces very similar results, as well as being quicker and easier to use. So that's the GAS and the outcome measurement. But GAS is more than that, because for me, it's an important part of GAS management training. It's that bringing the patient into that dialogue, encouraging them to set their own goals, and therefore regaining that autonomy of goal setting. And that's really what goal management training is about. We all have a to-do list. I have a to-do list. I try and get through it every weekend, and I find on Sunday evening I've never done more than half of it. But that's how it works. And essentially what we're doing with goal attainment scaling is we're getting patients back to that autonomy of being able to set their own goals and revise them and review them and move forward. So it supports that active engagement in setting and monitoring their own goals. We know that that can be challenging, particularly for patients with acquired brain injury, which is my particular patient group. Again, an Australian group has come out with a helpful framework for engaging patients in goal setting and setting out some individual strategies with practical advice. But within that, in point of fact, GAS will meet many of those requirements. So if we want to improve patient engagement in goal setting, part of our measurement needs to be, can we measure the improvement in patient engagement? And yes, we can. We've got a patient level of engagement scale, which can be used to monitor this. So in our context, again, because I work with acquired brain injury, we have patients who struggle with numbers or with words or with simple measurement scales. And we tend to use this visual analog scale where basically the inner circle, the more the color, the more the phenomenon is, whatever it is. So this is our patient level of engagement in goal setting, and they can be anything from the bottom, which is they're completely unable to engage in goal setting at any level, up to at the top, they're fully independent in goal monitoring, setting their own goals. And somewhere halfway up the scale, we've got good engagement where they require active support. The patient and the team are taking about 50-50 responsibility for the goals. But the corollary of that is, how satisfied is the patient that the goals are actually what they wanted to achieve? Because if they're not satisfied that the goals are really reflecting what they want to achieve, they're not going to be engaged in them. So we have a similar patient goal satisfaction scale, which is rated by the patient. Now, this is not their satisfaction with the treatment. This is purely their satisfaction with the goals as they were set, bearing in mind that we may have needed to negotiate some of those goals somewhat away from their original set targets. So again, we have the same type of scale ranging from the top, excellent, my goals matched all my priorities, rehab and entirely my own choice, down to none, my goals are completely irrelevant and I didn't agree with any of them, or worse, what goals? So together, those two scales provide evidence that GAS is not only a measure of intention of treatment, but actually it's a patient-reported outcome, a PROM, which is really reflecting what it was that the patient wanted to achieve. But even with the GAS light, goal setting can be time-consuming. And we've still got the problem that data are not comparable between patients. We've got no yardstick for comparing with other patients, other programs, because, as I say, we're measuring with a set of elastic bands. So we need to collect some standardized measures alongside for that comparable data. And the challenge, of course, is that individual goals can be very diverse. It's hard to find measures that reflect all of that diversity, which is the very reason that we were using GAS in the first place. So in the upper limb international spasticity study, the ULIS study, I wanted to just explain some of our experience with how we've developed GAS within that context. So the ULIS study is a series of international cohort studies we've been running for over 15 years. It looks at the use of botulinum toxin for upper limb spasticity in real life practice as it is used around the world. And throughout the program, we've had over 130 sites in 31 countries. And the GAS we chose quite early on as the primary outcome measure. So we've collected many goals from the course of that program over the 15 years in a lot of different patients. And what we found was that there were 6 key goal areas that were consistent across multiple studies and multiple sites. And those key goal areas for this upper limb spasticity management were reducing pain, reducing involuntary movements, spasms, increasing the range of movement, improving passive function, that's the ease of caring for the limb, or active function, the ease of using the limb, and mobility. So we know that actually pretty much most of the goals that are set fall into those, and we can see the overall rates of achievement, which have been more or less constant throughout the program. And that's allowed us to develop a structured approach to GAS called the GASIUS, or GAS Evaluation of Upper Limb Spasticity. And that's improved the quality and ease of goal setting. So the GASIUS tool takes those 6 key goal domains, and it provides suggested parameters for person-centered goal setting that have come out of our experience for setting those goals across those domains over the last 15 years. And it also includes a limited set of standardized measures that are recorded alongside, but are selected according to the chosen goals. So here we have our 6 goal areas, and here we have the standardized measures that would be applied in each of those goal areas. But instead of just recording all of those measures in every patient, most of which won't be relevant, we use the goal setting to identify, as in this example, the patient's set goals in pain and passive function. So in that case, the 2 standardized measures we would apply would be the standardized measure for pain, which is a score out of 10 on a visual analog scale, and of passive function, which is the ARMA scale passive function subscale. So we can still get comparable information, but we're only measuring those things that actually reflect the patient's individual goals for treatment. And that means to say that in a busy clinical setting, we've got standardized outcomes collected alongside, but they're relevant to the intentions of treatment. And in ULIS 3, which is our longitudinal study, the latest iteration of that program, we're now using that for systematic data collection in over 1,000 patients. If we look at the quality of goal setting, when we first introduced GAS as the primary measure in the ULIS 2, which was the second stage of the program, GAS was quite new to some of our investigators. So we performed goal reviews and evaluation, and we looked at the functionality of those goals, how well they were related to function, not just impairment, and we rated that on a score of A to C, and the smartness of the goals, which was rated on a score of ++ down to minus. And the aim was to get a score of A++ within each centre. We fed back to each centre about their goals and the smartness and function relatedness of them. And actually, after that feedback, we got significant improvement. But even at the end of the ULIS 2 phase, we still only had 25% of the centres rated at A++, which was still not showing very good quality of goal setting. So in ULIS 3, we used the gaseous as the primary measure, and at our very first evaluation, we found that 95% of the centres were already rated at A++. So that structured goal setting was timely and easier to use. It improved the quality of goal setting and the validity of measurement. So in summary, GAS is not just an outcome measure per se, it's a measure of achievement of intention and a tool to goal management training. It doesn't stand alone, it needs to be applied alongside other standardized measures for comparison, but it still forms an important part of outcome evaluation and a tool for that reflection. It doesn't have to be time-consuming or daunting, and structured goal sets can help take out some of the stress of goal setting for the common goal areas. It still doesn't replace the need for individual personalized goals. And so one of the things I think we're going to address further in the rest of this seminar is going to be the use of other structured goal sets and approaches that we can use to make GAS easier to use and standardize it. In the meantime, I'd like to acknowledge all the people who've helped us with our work on GAS, both within my unit, our international collaborators, and our members of the ULIS team. And we're going to hold questions and discussion to the last. I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and we're going to move over to our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to Professor Turner-Stokes. Our group and her group, I think, may be both equally passionate about goal attainment scaling, but we do come at it from slightly different angles at this stage, even though I think we've both been working in this area for a very long time. So I don't want to take too much time. I want to make sure we have time for questions, but I did want to spend a little bit of time just introducing our company and the different type of work that we do, very much focused on goal attainment scaling in research, and then talk a little bit about goal attainment scaling in particular in research settings and the origins of that, and then to pass it over to my colleague Sevinc, who will talk a little bit about some of the tools that we have for standardized implementation of goal attainment scaling in clinical development. So my name's Chere Chapman, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ardea Outcomes, which I have the real privilege of co-founding with my mentor, Dr. Kenneth Rockwood. You may know his name from goal attainment scaling in the early years when he first started to use it in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. He's also well known as a general geriatrician, an internist, and also someone who's really pioneered a lot of use of frailty in multiple different settings. But in the early years of considering goal attainment scaling, like Professor Turner-Stokes, he was very excited about the use of it in his clinical practice, and he still uses it daily at this point, even though he started in the mid-90s experimenting with the use of goal attainment scaling. And for him, like Professor Turner-Stokes, I think it's a real shared decision-making tool, and it gets to the root very quickly of what's important to patients and caregivers and families. And that was really important important to him, I think before patient centricity was an active thing. But in a research setting, what inspired him, I think, was the first thing, of course, that it's patient-centric, but in addition to that, it's a highly sensitive measure of change. And if you think back to some of those early Alzheimer's disease trials where therapeutic interventions may have been modest in their effects, if at all, it was important to have something that was highly sensitive to change and responsive that could capture any treatment effect if there was indeed a treatment effect there. And goal attainment scaling was able to pick up what was anecdotal and coming in from families and clinicians. But in addition to that, tell a lot about where these effects were coming from. So that's the second thing I think that he got inspired by, was the second order inference you get from goal attainment scaling. So if you do pick up a treatment effect, with goal attainment scaling, you can dive into which goals were set and then figure out which goals were driving that treatment effect. So you don't understand only whether it's working, but also how it's working, which is hugely informative in and of itself. So with his early interest in goal attainment scaling as a clinician researcher from the mid-90s onward, Dr. Rockwood decided to start this company specifically to bring this tool to sponsors and others in clinical research so that they'd have something patient-centric that would have these properties to allow for additional understanding of data that they were already collecting. So we set up the company, then called Dementia Guide Inc., because that's where we were focused, which eventually morphed into DGI Clinical. And now, because we focus exclusively on goal attainment scaling, but across a broad spectrum of disease areas, we recently rebranded as Ardea Outcomes. So here we are, 30 years later, still doing something similar from when we actually started. We aren't the only people doing goal attainment scaling. This actually shows excuse me, a word cloud from a search we did in September 2020 on clinicaltrials.gov, which looked at everything we could find that mentioned goal attainment scaling as an outcome in a trial listed on that site. You can see, even glancing at it, that Professor Turner-Stokes' work is well represented there, as is some of Dr. Rockwood's and ours, especially I think in Down syndrome, neurogenic bladder and bowel disorder, hemophilia, various applications in aging, frailty, and dementia. When we dove into these studies, the majority of them in goal attainment scaling were interventional, only some were observational, and most were listed as phase 2, phase 3, or phase 4, which is our experience as well for how people were using it. Nevertheless, the numbers weren't huge. It was well under 200 studies that we found, but they were increasing year on year, which was exciting for us. But we still had an issue in talking to sponsors and trying to get them to adopt this measure, whether as an exploratory, secondary, or primary or co-primary. We got two elements of feedback from sponsors quite consistently. The first one was that goal attainment scaling, as Professor Turner-Stokes rightly mentioned, can be cumbersome to implement, and people worried about a lack of consistency between sites, which Professor Turner-Stokes also mentioned. So we've devoted 30 years to try to figure that out and make it feasible and rigorous for implementation in clinical development. I think we're on to something, but Ganesh will be able to explain a few of the tools and techniques that we use as an organization to make that happen. But the second thing that sponsors brought up quite consistently was their real concern about how goal attainment scaling would be perceived by regulators. And I think it was a very important concern. So we had a lot of anecdotal evidence from working with the FDA and the EMA over time. We had multiple meetings with different sponsors. We had multiple critical path innovation meetings. We had multiple conversations on the sides of conferences and other fora. But it wasn't until this spring when the FDA came out with their most recent patient-focused drug development guidance, draft number 4, where they explicitly mentioned goal attainment scaling and its potential utility as a personalized endpoint in clinical development, that we started to see much more generalized enthusiasm among the research community for using goal attainment scaling. So this has been a really welcome development in our group, and I think in other groups who are considering using goal attainment scaling and now feel like they have a pathway to do that. The FDA talked about some advantages and also some issues we need to address. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Ganesh to go ahead and start working through some of those issues with you and some of the advantages of goal attainment scaling and our approach for how to implement it in a rigorous way in a trial setting.
Thank you, Chere. Hello, everyone. So I will briefly summarize advantages of goal attainment scaling and move on to the way we standardize implementation in clinical development. So first of all, compared to other standardized measures and or biomarkers, GAS has shown to be highly responsive to the treatment effects, especially in cases where the standardized measures may fail to achieve required sensitivity and specificity. It is responsive as there is no dilution of the treatment effect due to mixing affected and unaffected patients. So disease severity varies from patient to patient, and finding the right patients and the right tool with the right amount of sensitivity has always been challenging. A disease may affect multiple areas of feeling and functioning, and patients may have varying degrees of baseline states. In these cases, GAS has an obvious advantage as it by nature takes differing baseline states into consideration and also minimizes recall bias commonly seen at other patient-reported measures. Another strength of implementing GAS is the robust assessment of change, which is also clinically meaningful. As you all know, there is the problem of arbitrary threshold setting. There is the need to select a threshold for meaningful improvement and or worsening, and the level of change needs to be predefined and justified through extensive research. Even then, it is somewhat arbitrary. GAS overcomes the problem of arbitrariness in the definition of clinically meaningful difference and leverages clinicians' insights. Also, asking the patients what does better look like to you will result in a robust understanding of what's important to them. The FDA guidance has also detailed the process of selecting and justifying endpoints and emphasized the need for substantial evidence about the importance of the endpoint to the patients and or caregivers. But GAS is by definition relevant to the patient and more importantly, captures patient experience and lifts the heavy work on the front end or the back end. So as Chere mentioned, the FDA endorsed GAS in the most recent patient-focused drug development guidance, yet they also mentioned that the process for eliciting personalized endpoints have the potential for inconsistency. And here is how we standardize the process of goal attainment scaling. So we recommend selection of clinician interviewers based on specific criteria and qualifications, delivery of standardized training to all interviewers, patient and caregiver orientation to the goal setting process before the goal setting interview, and use of semi-standardized goal inventories in clinician training and patient orientation. We also recommend goal quality assurance through real-time goal reviews and interviewer-specific feedback, and the use of specialized GAS-focused electronic data capture platform to guide clinicians through the goal setting and attainment rating processes. We also highly endorse collection of open-ended input from patients and clinicians at each assessment point to capture ongoing relevance, importance, and also any other novel treatment effects. We also recommend ongoing interviewer support and retraining on GAS techniques and specialized GAS data monitoring. As you see, goal inventories are an essential part of the standardization process and are instrumental to achieve the desired standardization across sites and patients. Since they are at the core of how we standardize implementation, I will be talking through their benefits in detail in the next slides. So they are essentially lists of goals, symptoms, and challenges that are expected to change with treatment. Just to mention once again, they are not meant to be exhaustive and or fixed lists. The patients can always personalize items in the goal inventory or add new ones without any limits to the maximum number of goals. And goals, symptoms, and challenges can be nested under domains and be supported with descriptives, keywords, at any level. So They are instrumental as they offer a shared language between the clinician and the patient to facilitate smart goal setting. As you all know, GAS doesn't fall into standard categories of patient-reported, clinician-reported, observer-reported measures. We call it clinician-facilitated patient-centered outcome. So patients set goals together with a clinician based on what's important to them and also what's relevant to the treatment. The challenge here is that they don't always speak the same language. So goal inventories here again give patients and clinicians that common language and allow a better, faster communication. And why is this important? It's important because it has tremendous potential to shorten the time required to set goals and also optimize goal setting interview. They can also be used as part of patient orientation to goal attainment scaling process. And this can be achieved with a simple handout that describes the process to the patients and introduce goals, goal areas prior to goal setting interview. So here's an example from a phase 2 trial in patients with early Alzheimer's disease. And these handouts were shared with patients upon their enrollment to the study. And they were aimed at familiarizing them with goal setting process and introduce them potential goals. This way, they are given sufficient time to ponder on their personal goals and come to the goal setting interview prepared, cutting the goal setting interview time. So as Chere mentioned, GAS offers both quantitative and qualitative insights. And regardless of whether the treatment arm versus the control arm successfully achieved their goals or not, one can always further explore the data and investigate goal achievement per goal area and goal achievement per domain. Importantly, this second level analyses reveal additional insights into the data and may even allow the detection of novel treatment effects. This is especially valuable for cases where the model of disease severity or treatment effects are unknown. It's also clinician facilitated, so clinicians' involvement is essential to capture these unspecific treatment effects. So critically, the way to minimize bias in this analysis is to have the domains and goal areas identified before randomization, and the best way to achieve this is to have a semi-standardized goal inventory. This is why early adoption of GAS is critical. The inventory can be modified and iterated at each investigation, and the additional insights provided by these analyses can be incorporated into future research. So, and again, another challenge in goal setting is making sure that the goals reveal what's important to patients, but also are in the areas that are expected to change with treatment. Goal inventories are prepared with input from clinicians and other scientists paying attention to the drug's mechanism of action. And when they are included in the clinician training, they also provide a means to ensure that the goals are relevant to the treatment and also are expected to change it. Again, another concern by the regulatory bodies. And if it's a new compound, it's not always possible to know. As we know, 10 to 20% of approved drugs do not have a known target or mechanism of action. And in these cases, the semi-standardized nature of the inventory leaves room for clinician insight and allows capturing of novel treatment effects. Here in the next slide, we conducted a prospective study to compare inventory facilitated goal setting to standard goal setting in patients with dyslexia. 17 patients were involved and 9 participants were presented with an inventory and 8 were not, and a total of 63 goals were set. So, and the data showed that having an inventory slightly increased number of goals set, and more importantly, those that had an inventory set more goals in self-advocacy and social domains in relation to their dyslexia symptoms. And this influence is critical because you still want to keep the personalized nature of the tool while also limiting type of goals set within a trial to ensure that the goals are relevant to the treatments. And how they are developed, they are usually prepared with input from patients and disease experts, with special consideration given to the conceptual model of the disease and the product's proposed mechanism of action. And the rigor depends on time and resources. The research typically begins with literature review and open-ended interviews with patients. moves on to validation with clinicians, continues with feasibility testing in a trial setting, and culminates in additional research with patients to produce a final inventory. Again, we use multiple methods and update the inventory at each iteration. And here I have in the next slide, I have a case study example from hemophilia. In this case, again, we created a preliminary list of goal areas and attainment levels through 2 workshops with multidisciplinary groups of hemophilia experts. And then we revised the list of goals and descriptors with input from patients and caregivers, assess feasibility through a 12-week prospective study, and then conducted another patient voice study, follow-up study, to evaluate the language, relevance, and usefulness of each goal through an online survey, multiple qualitative interviews, and focus group with patients. I have the reference here on the slide, but we do have 2 more publications where we detail the process with which we developed goal inventories, one in neurogenic bladder and bowel dysfunction, and another in Down syndrome associated Alzheimer's disease. And you can find these publications at our websites at the resources section. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can move on to questions. So maybe we can stop sharing now and just have the 3 of us up. Yeah, this would be great. Yeah, so I'm just we have some questions that are rolling in, but nevertheless, I thought we would just throw one out there. Professor Turner-Stokes, with your experience, we have had this asked to us by many sponsors, since they know that we can do goal attainment scaling open-ended without an inventory. Even though it's valuable to do so, it does seem like quite an upfront lift to carefully develop a goal inventory. And if you look at the amount of data you had and used to develop the inventory that you did, is it worth it? Or is it something that you can strive to along the way?
I think that's a really good question. To me, I mean, we tend to use we've developed goal inventories for anything from overall rehabilitation to spasticity management to other things as we've gone. As you gain experience, you get to know what the goals are, and it makes sense to actually use ones that have been used earlier, because we all get used to goal setting. I think that but it's really important fundamentally that goal attainment scaling is individualized. You know, frankly, there's no point in just having a standardized measure and then applying the, well, which measure, which level of that measure did I expect to reach. We can use it like that, and we do routinely use gas to evaluate the FIM plus FAM when we score that. But actually, the essence of goal attainment scaling is that it's that personal goal around what really matters to the patient, which you won't always get in the standardized measures. So I think goal inventories can be very useful for taking some of that stuff out, but they really don't stand alone. You do need that individualized approach. And just as a quick example for perhaps people less familiar with it, for example, in rehabilitation, very often people need to go home, and then they say, I want to be able to walk out in the community. So the question is, lots of people say, well, what we'll set a goal to walk 100 yards. Well, that's not terribly useful, to be honest, because where does 100 yards get you at home? Whereas if your goal is to walk to the shops, that might be 100 yards away, it might be 500 yards away, but you can still get to the shops, which is a really important thing, because otherwise you can walk 100 yards and still not get to the shops. So do you see what I mean? It's a sense, but it's a way of really personalizing the fact that you're not only dealing with the person, you're also dealing with their environment. And that's why goals can be easier or harder depending on how far the shops are away. If that's a good example.
Great example. Ganesh, did you want to layer in anything on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think goal inventories, in the way we use it, are never meant to be final or non-personal lists. So they are like buckets of goal areas that are relevant to the drug or which are expected to change with the drug or intervention at hand, and they choose the goal, and then the patients are asked to further personalize the goal in line with your example. So there's always a tension between individualization and standardization, and FDA guidance perfectly mentioned that the process to develop goals need to be standardized, not the goals. And I believe the way we use goal inventories are good means to achieve that and standardize the process.
Yeah, I don't know what you think about this, Professor. Maybe this is free advice I'm going to ask for on this webinar, but we've actually had situations where people have come to us and said, in our trial, we're only interested in these 5 things, so we're going to use goal attainment scaling as long as everybody will set these 3 or these 5 goals. And so I agree with what you said. It really resonates that we're missing the whole point with goal attainment scaling. We're missing that personalization. We have tried to compromise in the past, and so we have had situations where sponsors are keen to say, we're not exactly sure how these treatment effects are going to manifest. So we'd like it to at least suggest that people set goals in a variety of different domains. So we'd like everybody to set 3 to 5 goals, and we really don't want all 3 goals, say, in cognitive domain or in a behavioral domain. And so we've added that into the protocol and to the instructions for clinicians to work with patients to set goals in a variety of different areas. Is that something you've worked with before, or that type of, like Ganesh said, it's a bit of a tension, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, I think you can use gas in so many different ways, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve, and whether it's a trial or whether it's in the individual setting. I think that it's forcing things into. I wouldn't agree with forcing things in. You've got to set a goal in cognition and behavior and this, because actually the goals for treatment may not be that, as was a good example with the gaseous. You know, they're really bothered about their pain and their passive function. They're not trying to get active function. They've got a limb that's not going to move. It's never going to move. There's no point in doing that. So you really don't want to force goals in areas that are not either realistic or not things that you're trying to achieve. But in terms of getting that detail, and we'll come back to as well, that you said, which I think is really important, it's understanding the why when you get a change, and doing that deep dive into it. And particularly when you've got longitudinal goals and you've got patients coming back to a clinic over several different times, goal attainment scaling gets easier and quicker as you go along, because you know what the patient's trying to achieve, they know what they're trying to achieve, and you've already got some of that discussion. There was a question, I think, earlier on, which is how long does it take? Well, yeah, it takes us as long as the goal setting, and as we discussed, the attainment scaling can fall out of that normal discussion. But the important thing is that we have that discussion about where we bring together what the patient wants to achieve and what is possible to achieve, and we agree that that's something worth striving for. That's really the key cornerstone to this, isn't it?
Yeah, we've had a similar experience in the sense that people get better at goal attainment scaling, and it does get quicker, even when you're doing the full scales. We with our training, we do try to get the goal setting to be around 10 minutes per goal. So if you're setting 3 goals for treatment, then we strive for 10 minutes per goal area, so a 30-minute baseline interview. Sometimes it's much longer. There are cases when it is much shorter. I do think it depends on the skill of the clinician. So we try to ensure that they're well trained before they get into a trial situation. We did have another question there too. I don't know the answer to this one. Is gas automatically incorporated into any electronic medical records? I know there's been some really interesting work with goal attainment scaling in depression, and goal attainment scaling inventory was developed for that, and they did work with an organization to enable this to be incorporated into medical records in the US. I'm not sure if that's often the case, and we've done work in hemophilia, and that work has now been adopted by a national nonprofit in the US. It may be in some medical records, but not all. I'm not sure if it's automatically incorporated. Do you have any experience with that in the UK or elsewhere, Australia, Professor Turner-Stokes?
Yes, indeed. In the UK, I mean, we incorporated it into our electronic database back in the back in the early 2000s, and it's been in there all of the time. And the goal setting approach has automatically applied the number side of things. So we've had that incorporated in the UK ROC National Clinical Database, which is our sort of equivalent of, say, the UDS for the FIM. I'm not quite sure what other databases people are familiar with, but our national clinical database for all of our outcomes in the UK does include the gas if people want to use the gas in there. So yes, it's incorporated into a number of things, and certainly in rehabilitation, I mean, goal setting is something that nearly every rehabilitation clinician says that they do. So if you're going to do goal setting, why wouldn't you integrate gas in your electronic patient record? It's very simple to do.
Yeah, we have the same experience here. We do have software that we use in all the clinical trials that we're a part of. And so that also, I find it automatically captures it, but it also walks the clinician through the process of goal setting. So it allows, I think, again, like a training opportunity for those that are new to using it. So it is, I think, an interesting thing, especially in this day and age, to use software to facilitate that. And it seems like the next logical step to have that integrated into the whole medical record as we go. We have another question here around training and administration. So it's a little off topic from exactly what we were talking about today. In our case, we use goal inventories as part of our training. And so we use them in a few ways, like Ganesh mentioned. We use them to orient patients and families to the whole process of goal attainment scaling. Where we use the software, we embed the inventory in it. And then we try to take detailed examples from the inventory for our training for clinicians. Is that the way you've used those types of goal inventories too? Do they have a specific function for you when you're training people, when you have an inventory at hand?
When we're doing goal attainment scaling, we don't necessarily start with the inventories. We start with the concept. Again, this may be because I'm using it in the context of rehabilitation, and in rehabilitation, which is, say, different from, say, neurology or something like that, every clinician sets goals. That's what they do. It's the cornerstone of rehabilitation. Therefore, that's why we just set the gas to fall out of it. So we've only really got to concentrate on that back end of the numbers bit, because all of the rest should be embedded. And because of that, and because people are used to doing that, then goal inventories take a second, take a back stop. But certainly when it came to, for example, the ULIS study, and trying to train a lot of different people, and particularly neurologists who weren't so familiar with it, actually then having the gaseous, the structured tool, as we discussed, made that much easier. So I think it depends on the setting in which you're using. If you've already got people having that conversation around goal setting, you don't really need to do a lot of training other than to, explain how the numbers fall out. If you haven't got somebody who's used to goal setting, you're back a further step down the line, and then having your examples can be really useful. And then the other group that we've done, we did a set of inventory for prolonged disorders of consciousness, because in that situation your patient can't be involved with the goal setting, but there are certain tasks that the clinicians need to do as a to-do list in there, which may not be relevant in all of the patients, but again, having a pick list there helped the clinicians to understand what on earth it was they were doing with patients in prolonged disorders of consciousness if they couldn't be engaged in rehabilitation. So it can help in all sorts of ways.
Fantastic, thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers for that excellent and very insightful presentation. We have now reached the end of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Ardea Outcomes may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email address that's displayed on the screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box, and let me just do that right now, where you will be able to view the recording of this event. You can also share this link with your colleagues so that when they register for the recording there, they can view it as well. So I do encourage you to do so. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers today, Professor Lynne Turner-Stokes, Chere Chapman, and Dr. Ganesh Sevinc. We hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at X Talks, thank you once again for joining, and until next time, take care and bye for now.